You know that feeling when you're trying to explain something you're really passionate about, but um, it just doesn't seem to stick. Like your message is just bouncing off this wall of, well, everything else.
Yeah, definitely.
Today, we're digging into why that happens
Yeah.
and, more importantly, what you can actually do about it. Because, having a fantastic offering isn't enough.
hmm
You got to win what the smart folks call the battle for your mind.
Exactly. I mean, just think about how much information we all process every single day. It's just a constant barrage, isn't it?
Totally.
So this deep dive is really all about giving you a strategic advantage in that environment, a way to actually break through and be remembered.
And to do that, we're pulling apart a real classic,
Yeah.
Positioning, The Battle for Your Mind
Yeah.
by Al Ries and Jack Trout. Consider this our way of like giving you the Cliffs Notes, but with a bit more, well, deep diving.
Right.
We've identified 7 key areas, almost like 7 insider secrets to how the mind works when it comes to brands and messages.
And these mind secrets, they're not just theoretical, they have real world implications for pretty much anyone trying to make an impact, whether you're launching something new, trying to grow something established, or even just trying to communicate your ideas more effectively in your own field.
Absolutely. So what are these core ideas we're going to explore? First up, we're tackling cracking the code of the overcommunicated mind.
hmm
Then we'll look at the first in advantage, planting your flag in the mind. Following that, we'll get into mind ladders and the art of perception restructuring.
Okay.
After that, it's leadership versus followership, different paths to positioning power, and then finding your unique hole, the power of niche creation.
Lots to cover.
Yeah. And our sixth area is the name game, crafting a position with every syllable. And we'll wrap up by navigating the perils, avoiding deadly positioning traps.
It's really a framework for thinking strategically about how you fit into the competitive landscape, not just in terms of your features or benefits, but how you are actually perceived by your audience. That's the key.
Totally. By the time we're done here, you should have a much clearer sense of how to cut through the clutter and position yourself for some serious traction. Okay, let's dive right into that first mind secret, cracking the code of the overcommunicated mind.
Yeah, this one's fundamental. I mean, just think about your own daily experience. How
Yeah.
many ads do you see? How many emails do you get? How many social media posts are just like vying for your attention?
It's endless.
It really is. Studies have shown that advertising consumption per person in the US is just incredibly high.
Yeah.
It creates what you could call a massive bottleneck in the mind, a real jam.
It's like trying to send a text message during a stadium concert, just a
Mhm.
massive traffic jam of information, right? So what's the upside for us in understanding this reality?
Well, it forces you to be much more disciplined in your communication. You realize the power of simplicity and focus in your messaging. It also highlights the effectiveness of targeting your message to a very specific, well-defined audience. And perhaps most importantly, it underscores the fact that what people perceive about you is ultimately their reality.
Right, perception is reality.
Got it.
So if we ignore this overwhelming amount of noise, what are the likely consequences for our message?
Well, it's highly likely that your message will simply get lost, plain and simple.
Mhm.
You might overestimate the impact of broad, untargeted campaigns, thinking they're resonating when they're really just fading into the background noise.
Mhm.
And you definitely risk failing to make a strong initial impression because the mind simply cannot process and retain everything that's thrown its way. It just filters most of it out.
Okay. So thinking about companies here in the U.S., how have some successfully navigated this information overload? What have they done right?
Well, we've seen some really effective approaches. Look at how Apple, when they first launched the iPod, focused on that incredibly simple message: 1,000 songs in your pocket.
Right. So simple, so
Yes.
clear.
Exactly. They distilled a complex piece of technology down to its core tangible benefit, instantly understandable.
Yeah, not about the gigabytes or the processing power, just the core value.
Precisely. Then you have the boom in like direct-to-consumer brands that focus on very specific niches. They don't try to appeal to everyone. They craft highly targeted messages for a very defined customer.
Yep.
And then you have the established giants like Coca-Cola who have maintained a remarkably consistent core message over decades, building incredible brand recognition through, repetition and focus.
That consistency definitely seems key in a noisy world. What about when companies get it wrong? What are some common mistakes they make in this over-communicated environment?
One frequent error is trying to communicate too much in a single message. The book points to Chevrolet as an example. Despite significant advertising spend, they often lacked a clear, consistent position in the minds of consumers because they tried to highlight too many different features across their range, you know.
Yeah, it's like they were listing every single bell and whistle instead of focusing on one or two key memorable ideas. It just becomes noise.
Exactly. Another misstep is using broad, untargeted advertising. If you try to speak to everyone, your message often ends up being diluted and doesn't really connect deeply with anyone. And constantly changing your message or, trying to be all things to all people just creates confusion and prevents you from establishing any clear, lasting impression. The mind just can't keep up.
Okay, so for you, the listener, trying to cut through this noise, what's the key takeaway here? How can you apply this principle?
The crucial thing is to really accept and understand just how overcommunicated the mind is. You need to be ruthless in simplifying your message. Like, what is the absolute core idea you want to own in the minds of your target audience?
Okay.
Think back to Apple's early positioning of the Macintosh as the computer for the rest of us. It wasn't about raw power. It was about accessibility and a different kind of user experience.
Right.
Focus on that one powerful, simple idea and communicate it clearly and consistently to a well-defined target. That's how you start to cut through.
All right, let's move on to our second mind secret, the first in advantage. Now, it sounds pretty straightforward being the first, but I imagine there's more nuance to it than just like who launched earliest chronologically, right?
Oh, absolutely. While being chronologically first can certainly give you a significant head start, the real power of the first in principle lies in being the first to establish a clear and compelling position in the prospect's mind within a specific category.
Oh, okay.
In the mind.
Yes, it's about that initial imprinting. People tend to strongly associate the first brand they encounter with a new type of product or service. It just sticks.
So what makes being first in the mind such a powerful advantage then?
Well, it just makes it significantly easier to establish a strong and lasting position. The first brand often captures a disproportionately large share of the market over the long term. It's quite remarkable.
And you tend to build stronger brand loyalty because consumers often just stick with what's familiar and what they encountered first when a category was new to them. It's sort of the default.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
What are the challenges and downsides if you're not the first to stake that claim in the mind?
Well, it becomes considerably more difficult to carve out your own unique and defensible space. You might have to try and reposition an existing brand in the mind, which is a costly and often uphill battle. Really tough.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And you always run the risk of being perceived as simply a Me Too option, just struggling for recognition and market share in an already crowded mental landscape.
Can you give us some examples of U.S. companies that really leveraged the first-in advantage effectively?
Sure. Think about Amazon and online books. Now, they weren't the very first website, but they rapidly became the dominant player in that specific category, firmly establishing themselves as the go-to for buying books online in the minds of consumers early on.
Right, they really did become synonymous with that early online shopping experience for books, didn't they?
Exactly. Or consider Google and internet search. Again, they weren't the absolute first search engine, but they quickly became the primary way people thought about finding information online. They just imprinted that core function in our collective consciousness.
Yeah, hard to imagine search before Google now.
It is. And even in a more specific market, Starbucks, while not the only coffee shop, arguably established itself as the first prominent brand in the premium coffee experience here in the US, setting a new standard in many people's minds. They owned that space first.
So where do competitors often stumble when they're not the first to establish that mental position? What are the common mistakes?
Well, a major mistake is entering a market late without offering a really clear and compelling differentiation or, a new first position to own. Many companies that followed Amazon in e-commerce, for example, struggled because they didn't give consumers a strong enough reason to switch their established mental association.
Right, just being another online store wasn't a strong enough hook, was it?
Precisely. Not compelling enough. Another common misstep is underestimating the enduring power of being first. Consider Coke and Pepsi. Coke had that early lead in the cola category. And even with Pepsi's massive marketing efforts over decades, that initial association still holds significant weight for many consumers. It's hard to overcome.
True.
And finally, companies often fail when they simply offer a slightly better version of an existing product without identifying a unique first attribute or category that they can credibly claim. As the book emphasizes, most Me Too products ultimately don't succeed. They just don't stand out.
Okay, so for you, the listener, trying to apply this first in principle, what should you be thinking about?
Well, if you have a truly innovative product or service, your priority should be to establish it as the first in its specific category in the minds of your target audience. Get there quickly and make a strong, clear initial impression. If you're entering an existing market, you need to identify a specific niche or a unique attribute where you can credibly claim to be the first to offer that in the perception of the consumer. Don't underestimate the lasting power of that initial mental foothold. Think about Tesla.
Right.
They weren't the first company to make electric cars, not by a long shot, but they positioned themselves as the first widely successful and desirable electric vehicle, capturing a powerful first position in that modern context.
That makes a lot of sense. Finding your first. Now let's move on to our third mind secret, mind ladders. This sounds like it's about how we mentally organize the different brands and products we encounter. It's almost like a filing system in our brains, right?
Exactly. Because we're constantly bombarded with information, our minds naturally create these hierarchical structures, almost like rungs on a ladder, to organize brands and products by category. You probably have a mental ranking of, say, coffee brands or types of cars in your head right now, even if you don't consciously think about it.
Yeah, I can definitely picture that. So if I'm thinking about, say, athletic shoes, there might be a performance running shoe ladder with Nike and Adidas perhaps on the higher rungs.
Precisely. And here's the key. Our minds tend to accept new information that aligns with these existing mental structures and reject information that doesn't quite fit. It's like sorting mail.
Okay.
So if you're introducing a new brand, you often need to either position it in relation to an existing rung on a familiar ladder or actively work to reposition the brands that are already there. You have to figure out where you fit on their shelf.
Why is understanding these mind ladders so crucial for someone trying to position their offering effectively? What's the benefit?
Well, first, it helps you understand where your brand currently sits in the mental hierarchy compared to your competitors. Are you even on the ladder in their minds? What rung do you occupy, if any?
Right.
Second, it allows you to develop strategies to either climb higher on that existing ladder or even to create a new ladder altogether if you have a truly novel offering that doesn't fit neatly into existing categories. And third, you can tailor your messaging to either align with or challenge existing perceptions, which dramatically increases the likelihood of your message being heard and accepted rather than just ignored.
What happens if you completely ignore these mental structures that already exist in people's minds? What's the risk?
Well, your advertising and communication efforts might simply fall flat because they just don't connect with how people already categorize things. You'll struggle to differentiate your brand in a meaningful way because you're not addressing its place within their existing mental framework.
Okay.
And you'll likely waste a lot of resources on communication that the mind just filters out because it doesn't fit into any established category or ladder. It just gets discarded.
Can you give us some concrete examples of U.S. companies that have cleverly used this understanding of mind ladders in their positioning?
Absolutely. Think about Avis with their famous "We Try Harder" campaign.
Oh, yeah, classic.
Right. By explicitly positioning themselves as the clear number two to Hertz, they cleverly leveraged Hertz's strong top-of-mind position to define their own. It's a classic example of against positioning.
Yeah, we're not the leaders, so we have to work harder to earn your business. It's a smart way to use the leader's strength to your advantage, isn't it?
Exactly. It gives them a clear spot on the ladder relative to the leader. Then you have 7-Up with their Uncola campaign.
Right, the Uncola.
They didn't try to compete directly with Coke and Pepsi on the cola ladder. They positioned themselves as the refreshing alternative, the clear choice for those who didn't want a cola. They essentially created their own prominent rung on the beverage ladder by defining themselves against the leaders.
Clever.
And then there's Tylenol, which effectively repositioned itself by focusing on the perception that aspirin could cause stomach upset. They didn't just say they were a better pain reliever. They attacked a perceived weakness of the leading brand's category in people's minds, making room for themselves.
Those are great examples of either finding a rung or strategically trying to dislodge others from theirs.
Where do companies typically go wrong when it comes to mind ladders? What are the mistakes?
Well, a common mistake is advertising in a vacuum, as if their competitors don't already occupy significant space in the prospect's mind. These messages often fail to resonate because they don't acknowledge the existing mental landscape, the existing ladder.
Right, nor the context.
Exactly. Another pitfall is trying to directly compete with the leader on their own perceived strength. If you just say, we're better, without a specific differentiated point that relates to how the mind categorizes things, you'll likely struggle. It's usually not credible.
Hmm.
And finally, ignoring deeply ingrained perceptions within these mental ladders can be disastrous, as we saw with the infamous New Coke failure. They tried to change something fundamental about a category leader that was deeply entrenched in people's minds on their mental ladder, and it backfired spectacularly. People didn't want their ladder rearranged like that. Yeah, that was a big one. Okay, so for you, the listener, how can you start to apply this concept of mind ladders to your own situation? What's the practical advice?
Okay, the first step is to really try to understand the existing ladders in your industry within the minds of your target audience. Who are the dominant players? What positions do they currently hold? You have to map it out.
Right.
Then you need to honestly assess where your brand currently sits, if it occupies a clear position at all. Be objective. Finally, you need to strategically decide which position you want to own and develop a communication plan to either climb that existing ladder by differentiating yourself from those above you, or maybe to reposition the competition in some way to create a new advantageous space for yourself. Remember, it's not just about the objective quality of your offering.
Right.
It's about the perceptions that exist in the minds of your potential customers. Think about Southwest Airlines. They didn't try to be a full-service airline. They clearly positioned themselves as the low-fare option, creating a distinct and powerful rung on the travel ladder. They owned low fare.
Got it. Okay, our fourth mind secret shifts our focus a bit from overall market perception to strategy based on market share. Leadership versus followership. It sounds like the approach you take needs to be quite different depending on whether you're the top dog or, trying to gain ground.
Precisely. The positioning strategies that tend to be effective for a market leader are often completely different from those that will work for a company trying to gain market share. Leaders typically benefit from reinforcing their existing position and focusing on maybe expanding the overall market for the category.
Yeah.
Followers, on the other hand, usually need to find ways to differentiate themselves, either by directly attacking perceived weaknesses of the leader or by identifying and serving unmet needs within the market. Different game plans entirely.
What are the primary benefits for a company that manages to achieve and maintain market leadership? What's the payoff?
Well, leaders tend to enjoy significantly higher long-term market share, often substantially more than the number 2 brand. Consumers often have a kind of default preference for the leader and tend to make repeat purchases unless there's a very compelling reason to switch.
Loyalty.
Yeah, and leaders are also generally able to command the highest profit margins within their respective markets. Being number 1 usually pays well.
And what about the advantages for being a follower? It can't all be about playing catch-up, right? Are there unique opportunities for companies that aren't in the top spot?
Oh, absolutely. Followers have a significant opportunity to identify and capitalize on specific niches, what the book refers to as krenos, in the prospect's mind that the leader might not be fully addressing or even aware of. Little gaps.
Well, Crino again?
Exactly. They can also attempt to reposition the leader in the minds of consumers by highlighting even a relatively minor perceived problem or shortcoming with the leader's product or service. Find a chink in the armor. And in rapidly evolving markets or during periods of disruption, followers can sometimes be more agile and attack new opportunities before the leader has fully established dominance in those emerging areas. They can move faster sometimes.
What are the potential dangers and pitfalls for market leaders, though? What can cause them to lose their top position?
Leaders can definitely become vulnerable if they become complacent and fail to continuously defend their core position or react effectively and quickly to competitive threats. That's a big one.
Right, resting on their laurels.
Exactly. Trying to appeal to too broad an audience or be everything to everyone can dilute their focused image and create openings for more specialized competitors. And ignoring emerging trends or completely new product categories and not being among the first to establish leadership in those areas can be a very costly mistake in the long run. Think Blockbuster versus Netflix initially.
Oof, yeah, good example. And what about the potential downsides and challenges for companies that are in a follower position?
Well, the hard truth is the vast majority of Me Too products that simply try to imitate the leader without offering a clear and unique differentiation ultimately fail. It's just not a winning strategy most of the time.
Hmm.
Not identifying and focusing on a specific, underserved segment of the market can leave you struggling to gain traction in a crowded field. You just blend in. And directly attacking the leader head-on without a truly compelling differentiator and a well-defined strategy is usually a recipe for very limited success. If any, it's tough to beat the king at his own game.
Okay, let's look at some real-world examples here in the U.S. What are some typical positioning strategies employed by leading companies to maintain their dominance? How do they stay on top?
You often see leaders consistently reinforcing their core brand message and the primary benefit they offer. Think about Kleenex and facial tissues.
Yeah, it's almost generic now.
Right. They've done a remarkable job of simply owning that association in our minds through consistent communication over decades. Another common strategy for leaders, particularly large conglomerates like Procter & Gamble, is to introduce entirely new brands for entirely new product categories rather than trying to stretch an existing successful brand name across too many unrelated areas.
Okay.
Tide for laundry detergent and Pampers for diapers are classic examples of creating distinct brands for distinct positions. It keeps things clear.
Right. Avoids blurring the lines.
Exactly. And of course, leaders also tend to closely monitor their competition and react swiftly and decisively to any perceived threats to their market share. They have to protect their turf.
What about companies that are in a follower position? How do they try to gain ground and create a stronger position in the U.S. market? What are their moves?
Finding and exploiting a niche that Carnot is a classic and often very effective follower strategy. Look at the explosion of craft breweries in the U.S.
Oh, yeah, everywhere now.
Right. They haven't tried to directly compete with the massive production and distribution of Budweiser or Coors Light. Instead, they've focused on specific beer styles, local ingredients, and a more artisanal image, appealing to a distinct segment of beer drinkers. They found their holes. Another common approach is the high price strategy, positioning yourself as a premium alternative like Rolex in the watch market or maybe high-end organic food brands, owning the premium spot.
Right.
And then there's the strategy of repositioning the competition by highlighting a perceived negative aspect of their offering, like Scope's early advertising that focused on Listerine's less appealing medicine breath. That created an opening for Scope as the good taste alternative.
So what are some common mistakes that you see leading companies making that can jeopardize their leadership position? Where do they slip up?
Complacency is a huge risk, becoming too comfortable and failing to adapt to changing consumer preferences or new technological advancements. That's probably number one. Also, as we'll discuss in more detail later, the line extension trap, trying to put their brand name on too many unrelated products, can seriously dilute their core brand equity and confuse people.
Okay.
And finally, failing to adequately defend their core market against focused and well-positioned attacks from determined followers. Sometimes they just don't take the threat seriously enough until it's too late.
And what about the missteps that are commonly made by companies trying to gain ground as followers? Where do they go wrong?
Well, trying to directly imitate the leader in terms of their broad messaging and target audience is a frequent error. Just being a copycat rarely works.
Right.
Not identifying and focusing on a specific underserved segment of the market is another common pitfall. You need that focus. And perhaps most critically, failing to clearly and concisely communicate a compelling reason why consumers should choose them over the established leader is a major strategic misstep. You need a why.
Okay, so for you, our listener, trying to navigate this leader-follower dynamic, what's the key advice? How should they approach it?
You need to be ruthlessly honest about your current position in the market. Are you the leader or are you a follower? If you're a leader, your primary focus should be on reinforcing your dominance, actively defending against competitive threats, and strategically expanding your reach, maybe with new brands for new categories. Protect and grow.
Okay.
If you're in a follower position, your best bet is usually to identify a specific niche that Carnot that the leader isn't fully serving, or to find a genuine weakness of the leader that you can exploit to create a distinct and defensible position in the minds of your target audience. Find your angle. Think about the evolution of Netflix again. They started as a follower in the video rental market, right? But then strategically repositioned themselves first with mail-order DVDs, attacking Blockbuster's late fees and store limitations, and eventually with streaming, ultimately becoming the leader in a completely transformed landscape. They kept finding the next angle.
Great example of adapting. Let's move on to our fifth mind secret, which is all about carving out your own unique territory in the market. The power of niche creation, or as the book famously puts it, cherchez le gros créneau, look for the hole. We keep coming back to this.
Exactly, because it's so fundamental, especially for followers. This strategy is centered on identifying a specific, often underserved segment or a particular attribute in the prospect's mind that isn't strongly associated with any existing brand, and then focusing all of your efforts on occupying and owning that whole.
Okay.
The important thing to remember here is that these niches don't necessarily have to be massive or have immediately obvious widespread appeal. What truly matters is finding a position that isn't already firmly claimed by the dominant players in the market. Find the gap.
So what are the key advantages and benefits of successfully finding and filling this unique niche, this créneau, in the market?
Well, first and foremost, it allows you to effectively avoid direct head-to-head competition with those larger, more established companies that have significantly more resources. You sidestep the main battle. Smart. You have the potential to become a big fish in a small pond, really dominating that very specific segment of the market. And it can be surprisingly effective how even seemingly small or very focused niches can become quite profitable if they deeply resonate with a particular group of customers who feel underserved.
What are the potential downsides and risks if you don't manage to find that unique niche to occupy, if you just stay in the main scrum?
You run the very real risk of simply getting lost in the general clutter and noise of the broader market, struggling to differentiate yourself from everyone else who's competing for attention. You just don't stand out. It becomes significantly more challenging to build a loyal and dedicated customer base because you're not specifically catering to anyone's unique needs or desires. You're just general. And you also become much more vulnerable to being outmaneuvered and outspent by those larger, more broadly positioned competitors who have greater reach and resources. They can crush you.
Can you give us some clear examples of U.S. companies that have successfully identified and capitalized on a unique niche, a créneau, in the market?
Absolutely. Think about gourmet popcorn brands like Orville Redenbacher's.
Right.
They took a very basic commodity product, popcorn, and successfully carved out a premium, higher-priced niche by consistently positioning themselves as a higher-quality alternative. They owned gourmet popcorn.
Okay.
Then you have the low-price niche. While it might not always be the most glamorous position, brands that consistently offer the absolute lowest price can also find a strong and loyal customer base. The book mentions Exxon's Quip low-cost office system as an example from that era.
The budget option.
Exactly. And finally, there's the time of day niche, like with NyQuil. They were among the first to specifically market a cold and flu remedy for nighttime use, effectively filling that very specific time-based need in the minds of consumers.
Wow.
Brilliant niche.
Those are interesting examples, finding niches based on price, quality, even time of day. Where do companies often go wrong when they're trying to carve out one of these unique niches? What are the pitfalls here?
One common mistake, as the book points out, is what they call filling a factory hole, not a mind hole.
Okay, what does that mean?
This happens when companies identify potential niches based on their own internal production capabilities or available resources, rather than focusing on an actual unmet need or a unique perception that exists in the minds of their potential customers.
Inside-out thinking.
Exactly. The Ford Edsel is often cited as a classic example of a product that filled a perceived production gap for Ford, but utterly failed to resonate with consumer desires or perceptions. It didn't fill a mind hole.
Right.
Another pitfall is falling into the everybody trap, trying to appeal to too broad an audience and not clearly defining who your specific niche customer actually is, and just as importantly, who they are not. You have to choose. And finally, getting overly enamored with a particular technology or product feature without carefully considering how it fits into existing consumer perceptions and desires can also lead to failure. The book mentions Brown-Forman's Frost 880 dry white whiskey. It went against deeply ingrained color associations for whiskey, a perception issue.
So, for you, our listener, how can you apply this find your unique whole principle to your own endeavors? What's the action plan?
You really need to adopt an outside-in perspective. Start by carefully examining the market from the viewpoint of your potential customers. What are their unmet needs or desires? What specific attributes or benefits are not currently strongly owned by the existing market leaders? Look for those gaps.
Okay, really put yourself in their shoes.
Exactly. Don't be quick to dismiss seemingly small or very focused opportunities. These niche markets can often be surprisingly profitable and offer a much clearer path to establishing a strong position. Once you identify that potential hole in the prospect's mind, focus your messaging, your product development, and all of your efforts laser-like on filling that very specific créneau. Think about how Dollar Shave Club found a highly successful niche. They focused on affordable and convenient razor blade delivery, a specific need and attribute, convenience and low cost, that the established players weren't heavily emphasizing at the time. They found their hole.
Great point. All right, let's move on to a really fundamental aspect of positioning that often gets overlooked, I think, the name game. It might seem like a small detail, but a name can really set the stage for your entire positioning strategy, candidate. It's the hook.
Absolutely. Your product or company name is often the very first point of contact a potential customer has with your offering, and it plays a surprisingly critical role in shaping their initial perceptions. A well-chosen name can immediately reinforce your desired position in the market,
Right.
while a poorly chosen one can create negative associations that are incredibly difficult and costly to overcome, regardless of the actual quality or value of what you provide. The ideal scenario often is to have a name that almost sounds like it inherently belongs to the category you're in, without being so generic that it doesn't stand out at all. It's a tricky balance.
So what are the tangible benefits of investing the time and effort into choosing a really strong name for your product or company? Why bother?
Well, a good name effectively starts the positioning process for you, subtly or even directly hinting at how your brand should be perceived by the market. It gives you a head start.
Okay.
It can be a tremendous asset for long-term success, contributing significantly to brand memorability and the development of positive brand associations. And in many product categories where the actual functional differences between competing offerings are relatively small, a more effective and well-aligned name can actually translate into a noticeable sales advantage simply by creating a more favorable initial impression and making your brand easier to recall when a purchase decision is being made. The name itself becomes a differentiator.
Conversely, what are the potential negative consequences of having a poorly chosen or ineffective name? What's the damage?
A bad name can unfortunately set off a negative chain reaction in the mind of the consumer, reinforcing any initial unfavorable opinions or creating confusion about what you actually offer. The frustrating thing is that a bad name doesn't tend to improve over time, no matter how much money you spend on marketing and advertising. In fact, it can actually create a negative perception of the product itself, the service you provide, and even the price you're asking, regardless of the actual value you deliver to your customers. It's like a constant headwind.
Can you share some examples of companies here in the U.S. that have really excelled at the name game and chosen names that strongly support their desired market position?
Certainly. When companies are introducing entirely new product categories or aiming to establish a very distinct and novel position in the market, they often wisely choose to create completely new brand names that aren't tied to any existing
A
associations.
clean slate.
Exactly. Procter & Gamble did this brilliantly with the introduction of Tide for laundry detergent. Even though they already had a well-established soap brand in Ivory, they knew Ivory detergent wouldn't position it correctly. Toyota's strategic launch of Lexus as a separate brand for their luxury vehicles is another perfect example of creating a new name to clearly signal a new and premium position in the automotive market. Of Toyota Premium wouldn't have worked nearly as well.
Right.
The book emphasizes the idea that a truly new product often requires a new and distinct name to effectively climb a new ladder in the consumer's mind. We also frequently see companies choosing names that subtly suggest a key benefit or attribute of their product or service without being overly literal or descriptive. And while it might seem counterintuitive today with so many acronyms, the book also points out the initial wisdom of using full, pronounceable names to build recognition before potentially shortening them to initials later, though they caution strongly against jumping to initials too early.
What are some of the common mistakes that companies often make when it comes to naming their products or their businesses? Where do they trip up?
One very frequent mistake is falling into what the book calls the no-name trap, by relying too heavily on abstract names, or particularly by using only initials for their brand name prematurely before the full name has really become widely understood and recognized by their target audience.
Ah, the initial problem.
Yes. The book strongly argues that a company typically needs to achieve a significant level of brand awareness with its full name before it can effectively rely solely on its initials. IBM started as International Business Machines, right?
True.
Another common pitfall is making names that are intended to indicate light, low-calorie, or low-cost options sound too negative or unappealing. You still want it to sound desirable. And a significant mistake, as we touched on, is trying to leverage the positive associations and brand equity of an existing well-known brand name for a product or service that belongs to a completely different and unrelated category. Xerox's largely unsuccessful attempt to enter the personal computer market using the established Xerox name is a classic example.
Right. Xerox meant copiers in people's minds.
Exactly. The consumer mind simply struggles to effectively associate one name with two fundamentally different product categories. It creates confusion.
So for you, our listener, trying to make smart decisions about naming your own ventures, what are the key principles to keep in mind?
Invest significant time and careful consideration into the process of naming your product or company. Don't rush it. Choose names that are relatively easy to pronounce, simple to remember, and most importantly, that strongly support the specific position you are trying to establish and own in the minds of your target audience.
Okay.
For new products or services that are aiming to carve out a unique space in the market, strongly consider creating a fresh, relevant, and memorable name rather than simply adding an extension to an existing brand. Be cautious and avoid the temptation to use overly abstract or initial-based names too early in your brand-building journey. And also be wary of names that are too overtly descriptive of specific attributes, as they can sometimes limit your brand's future potential if you want to expand later. Think about the story of Lifesaver's initial attempt to launch bubble gum under their established candy brand name. It just didn't resonate.
Right.
And how the subsequent rebranding to Bubble Yum, a name that clearly communicated the fun and chewy nature of the product, made all the difference in its positioning and ultimate success. The name matched the position.
Great example.
Okay,
we've reached our seventh and final mind secret. Navigating the perils, specifically focusing on avoiding those common and potentially deadly positioning traps. It sounds like, even with a good understanding of positioning principles, there are still some significant pitfalls to watch out for, huh?
Oh, absolutely. Even with the best intentions and a solid grasp of effective positioning strategies, businesses can still inadvertently stumble into some common but very damaging traps that can significantly undermine their efforts and even lead to failure. The book specifically highlights a couple of particularly dangerous pitfalls that are worth being acutely aware of: the line extension trap and the no-name trap. Understanding the dynamics and potential consequences of these traps can save you a great deal of trouble and wasted resources down the road. They're really common.
Okay, let's start by taking a closer look at the line extension trap. What exactly does that entail, and what makes it such a risky strategy for businesses?
Right, the line extension trap is the seemingly logical but often flawed strategy of taking a successful and well-established brand name and just extending it to a wide array of new products or entering entirely different product categories, slapping the old name on the new thing.
Okay. Seems efficient, maybe?
Well, in the short term, it might appear to be an attractive approach. You can potentially leverage the existing brand recognition and goodwill to quickly gain distribution and initial sales for the new offerings. Seems like a shortcut. However, the long-term consequences of excessive line extension can be really detrimental to your overall brand positioning. The original brand's core message and its clear position in the minds of consumers can become increasingly blurred and weakened as it tries to represent too many different things across diverse product categories.
It gets diluted.
Exactly. The new line extension products themselves often struggle to establish a clear and distinct position in the market and can end up being easily forgettable. And ultimately, having a single brand name associated with a multitude of disparate and unrelated products can dilute the strength, focus, and overall equity of your primary brand. Consider a brand like Kraft.
Yeah.
It's been extended across so many different food categories: cheese, mac and cheese, dressings, barbecue sauce, that it almost ceases to have a strong, specific meaning in the minds of many consumers. It becomes more of an umbrella term than a clearly defined product promise. What is Kraft anymore?
Good point. So according to the book, are there any specific situations or conditions under which a line extension strategy might actually be a viable or even beneficial approach? Or is it always bad?
The book suggests it might be a less risky strategy in a few specific cases. For very small volume products that aren't intended to be major revenue drivers, maybe in extremely crowded and competitive fields where you need some initial brand recognition just to get noticed, though it's not recommended as a long-term positioning strategy even then.
Yeah.
For brands with very limited advertising budgets where leveraging existing brand awareness is maybe essential, for basic commodity products where differentiation is inherently difficult anyway, and perhaps for products that are primarily sold directly by sales representatives rather than relying heavily on strong brand brand recognition on retail shelves. But these are exceptions, not the rule.
What are some of the common mistakes that companies often make when they fall into the line extension trap, thinking it will be a straightforward path to growth? Why do they do it?
Well, a very common mistake is the fundamental assumption that the inherent strength and positive associations of their existing brand name will automatically and seamlessly transfer to a new product, especially if that new product belongs to a completely different and unrelated category.
Just assuming the magic rubs off.
Pretty much. For example, thinking that the success of a well-known laundry detergent brand will guarantee success for a completely different type of household cleaning product simply because it carries the same name. It usually doesn't work that way. Another frequent error is focusing on internal logic. The idea that it makes sense for our brand to offer this new product based on their internal capabilities or strategic goals, rather than critically considering how the brand extension will actually be perceived and understood by the target customer in the context of the existing market landscape and their mental ladders. Again, it's that outside-in thinking that's missing.
Now, let's turn our attention to the second dangerous trap you mentioned, the no-name trap. This sounds closely related to our earlier discussion about the importance of choosing the right name in the first place, right?
It is indeed very closely related. The no-name trap essentially refers to the strategic error of relying too heavily on abstract or nondescript names, or perhaps more commonly today, on using only initials for your brand name prematurely in its life cycle.
Okay.
While it's true that in very rare cases, particularly if you are the absolute first to market with a truly revolutionary product or service, and your brand name essentially becomes synonymous with the entire new category, like maybe Xerox did initially with copiers, this approach carries significant risks for the vast majority of businesses.
What are the primary downsides and potential negative consequences of falling into this no-name trap? Why are initials often bad early on?
Well, the human mind largely processes and remembers information through sound, through phonetics. Abstract names, and especially strings of initials, can be significantly more difficult for consumers to verbalize, remember, and ultimately recall when making a purchasing decision compared to full, pronounceable, and ideally meaningful names. They just don't roll off the tongue.
Harder to talk about.
Exactly. Companies that primarily rely on initials, especially in their early stages, often remain less familiar and less easily talked about among potential customers than those with clear and recognizable full names. And using initials too early in your brand's development can often suggest to consumers that the company expects them to already know who they are.
Right, a bit arrogant.
Yeah, which is rarely the case for newer growing businesses, potentially creating a barrier to connection and understanding. It feels impersonal.
What are some of the common missteps or flawed reasoning that can lead companies to fall into the no-name trap, opting for abstract names or premature use of initials?
One frequent mistake is prioritizing how a name or logo looks visually. Perhaps a visually appealing logo comprised of initials over how the name sounds and how easy it is for people to say and remember in everyday conversation. Form over function, basically. Another common pitfall is prematurely shortening the brand name to its initials before the full name has achieved widespread recognition, understanding, and positive associations in the minds of the target audience. They jump the gun. And generally, underestimating the crucial value of having a name that is not only memorable but also easily shareable and referable through word-of-mouth communication is a significant misjudgment. Initials are harder to share verbally.
So for you, our listener, trying to navigate these potential positioning pitfalls, what's the key advice for avoiding the line extension and no-name traps? How do they stay safe?
Be extremely cautious and critically evaluate the long-term implications before considering extending a successful brand name into significantly new and different product categories. Really think it through. While the initial allure of leveraging existing brand recognition might seem strong, it frequently leads to a dilution of your core brand's focused position and can ultimately weaken its overall impact in the market. Don't sacrifice the core. For new ventures or products that are aiming to establish a unique and distinct space in the minds of consumers, really prioritize the creation of a fresh, relevant, and memorable name that directly supports that desired position. A new position often needs a new name.
Right.
Resist the temptation to rely on abstract or initial-based names until your full brand name has achieved significant recognition, understanding, and positive associations with your target audience. Earn the right to use initials, maybe? Remember that building a strong and enduring position in the market is a long-term endeavor that requires careful consideration of every element of your brand, and your name is a foundational piece of that puzzle. Think back to how Lifesavers' attempt to extend their established candy brand into the bubblegum market ultimately faltered, highlighting the risks of line extension. And consider how initially using the full and descriptive name International Business Machines helped to establish a strong foundation for what eventually became the universally recognized and powerful IBM brand. They built the base first.
That brings us to the culmination of our deep dive into positioning, the battle for your mind.
Yeah.
It's really underscored the fundamental truth that achieving lasting success in business is so often about winning that crucial and fiercely contested space in the minds of your target customers.
Absolutely. By truly understanding and thoughtfully applying these 7 key mind secrets that we've explored today, you can equip yourself with a significant strategic advantage in navigating the complexities of the modern marketplace and effectively position both yourself and your offerings for greater and more sustainable success. Ultimately, it's not solely about the inherent quality of what you have to offer. It's just as much, if not more, about how you are perceived by those you are trying to reach. Perception really is the battleground.
So as you continue to develop your own strategies and navigate your respective markets, I encourage you, the listener, to really consider which of these 7 mind secrets resonates most strongly with the specific challenges or opportunities that you are currently facing. Where might you need to refine your focus or perhaps shift your perspective in this ongoing and ever-evolving battle for your audience's mind?
Yeah, it's definitely not a one-time exercise, is it? It's a continuous process of evaluation, adaptation, and refinement. Your brand's position in the mental landscape of your customers is not static, and it requires ongoing attention and strategic thinking. You got to keep tending to it.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks so much for joining us for this in-depth exploration. We genuinely hope that these insights provide you with a valuable new lens through which to view your own efforts to make your message heard. Until our next deep dive, keep thinking strategically. You know that feeling when you're trying to explain something you're really passionate about, but it just doesn't seem to stick. Like your message is just bouncing off this wall of, well, everything else.
Yeah, definitely.
Today, we're digging into why that happens and more importantly, what you can actually do about it. Because, having a fantastic offering isn't enough. You got to win what the smart folks call the battle for your mind.
Exactly. I mean, just think about how much information we all process every single day. It's just a constant barrage, isn't it?
Totally.
So this deep dive is really all about giving you a strategic advantage in that environment, a way to actually break through and be remembered.
And to do that, we're pulling apart a real classic.
Yeah.
Positioning, The Battle for Your Mind by Al Ries and Jack Trout. Consider this our way of giving you the Cliff's Notes, but with a bit more, deep diving.
Right.
We've identified 7 key areas, almost like 7 insider secrets to how the mind works when it comes to brands and messages.
And these mind secrets, they're not just theoretical, they have real world implications for pretty much anyone trying to make an impact, whether you're launching something new, trying to grow something established, or even just trying to communicate your ideas more effectively in your own field.
Absolutely. So what are these core ideas we're going to explore? First up, we're tackling cracking the code of the over-communicated mind. Then we'll look at the first-in advantage, planting your flag in the mind. Following that, we'll get into mind ladders and the art of perception restructuring.
Okay.
After that, it's leadership versus followership, different paths to positioning power, and then finding your unique whole, the power of niche creation.
Lots to cover.
Yeah. And our 6th area is the name game, crafting a position with every syllable. And we'll wrap up by navigating the perils, avoiding deadly positioning traps.
It's really a framework for thinking strategically about how you fit into the competitive landscape, not just in terms of your features or benefits, but how you are actually perceived by your audience. That's the key.
Totally. By the time we're done here, you should have a much clearer sense of how to cut through the clutter and position yourself for some serious traction. Okay, let's dive right into that first mind secret, cracking the